Should they have access to water at their home? Should they allowed to be able to get electricity at their home, or phone lines, or all of these things? I mean, this is where we're headed, especially when you... January 1, we got anything good for the people?
Well, I don't know how good it is. I guess we're going to find out how good it is. It's not something I'm thrilled about by any stretch of the imagination. So you and I have been talking for a couple of weeks now, ever since this scandal around Carl Benjamin, or Sargon of Akkad, broke. And we decided, well, a while back, that we were going to, well, do a variety of things, right? We were going to announce our departure from Patreon, which is what we're doing in this video. I'm going to leave Patreon January 15th.
I also am going to leave Patreon on January 15th, which, by the way, we should just be clear, this is not something that we wanted to do. We were both perfectly happy on Patreon. Patreon, at least for me, it's been the backbone of my show. I mean, that's somewhere between 60 and 70% of our funding is through Patreon. So this is not something we wanted to do. I know we're going to talk about a whole bunch of things in this recording, but that New York Times article that came out, the implication was, oh, we're doing this for money. It's like, we're taking a major hit right now and opening ourselves up to all sorts of risks. So I'm going ahead and doing that because I believe we can do something better. We've got to figure out exactly what that is, and that's what we're working on. But
so we can say two things. I mean, I'd also like to thank the Patreon people for what they did in the past, because they provided me with a tremendous amount of, or the ability, the opportunity to generate a tremendous amount of financial support at a time I really needed it. And so I'm not happy in the least with what has happened. I have thought about it a lot and believe that, given Patreon's proclivity to censor and the reasons that they're doing it, especially as I've looked more and more deeply into the reasons, particularly with regards to my discovery of the website Change the Terms, I've become increasingly convinced that it's unethical to continue my association with the company. And I also agree, Jack Conte said in that New York Times article, trying to justify, say, Sam Harris's departure and our threatened departure, that it was motivated primarily by financial gain. And like, look, I've got nothing against financial gain. Mm-hmm. You know, I've said that from the beginning. And if things that I'm doing generate an honest amount of money that I can put to reasonable use, then so much the better. But this is a major financial blow. I'm using the Patreon money for a variety of reasons, most particularly to support this educational endeavor that I've talked to people about, right? Our attempt to build an online education system. And so, like, it's a major hit.
Yeah, and of course, you know, just to be clear, it's like when we're doing my show, I mean, I don't have to tell everybody about YouTube demonetization, but for example, my show a week or two ago with Imam Tawhidi was demonetized by the algorithm, then demonetized further after manual review by a human. So it's Patreon, it's the supporters, the individual people that allow us to go ahead and do more of these controversial, so to speak, episodes. So yeah, just nothing that we're doing right now is against the people that have supported us or our patrons or anything like that. This is about making a stand against this ever-moving encroachment on free speech, on free expression, and the rest of it. And it's like, this is one that we just feel is the right one to make the move on.
And the reason that we jointly decided on January 15th, well, there was a couple of reasons. The first was that we thought that we might have something approximating an alternative potentially available for preliminary launch at that date, although we've decided to delay that because the user interface needs work. Because that's the other thing, right, is that there needs perhaps to be a replacement for Patreon if that's a possibility. Like, it's not obvious to me that corporations can run platforms for untrammeled communication successfully on the net in today's climate. And that would include anything I might design. But let's not gloss over that. I mean, it might be possible that the Patreon method is not what's needed exactly for the future of the internet. I mean, this is what we're trying to figure out right now, which is why we've got every engineer, I mean, people from Google and Facebook and Yahoo and everybody reaching out to us, because it's like everyone's trying to solve this problem. And it's still, I mean, one of the things we've been talking about now for the last, well, it's really for the last year, but intensely in the last month, is what actually is the problem itself.
because until we really figure out what the problem is.
Well, I think the problem is how to regulate an incredibly diverse range of opinions. If such regulation needs to be instantiated, we could take a limit case, for example, the desire of companies like Facebook not to have their platforms used for recruitment for ISIS. It's hard to make a case that that's not a reasonable restriction.
Right.
But then the next issue is, I think you could make an exception there because maybe you consider that a wartime exception or something like that. But then the fundamental problem to me seems to be, and I'll return again to that Change the Terms website, that a whole variety of companies and organizations, spearheaded in not least by the Southern Poverty Law Center, that hateful organization.
Yeah, the worst.
That has decided that they're going to compel, encourage, defame, perhaps, companies that don't band together to regulate what they see as hate speech.
Yeah, and this is where the moving line is the key part of this, because you can always find the most fringe cases. You can always find ISIS on one side and, the most fringe KKK, white supremacist group or whatever you want to call it, on the other side. But let's not forget, Southern Poverty Law Center, they've written things about you, they've written things about me, Ayan Hirsi Ali and Majid Nawaz and Sam Harris and Douglas Murray, and a litany of other good. Majid sued them to and actually won. So there is a pushback, but this is just another level of the stand. It's like they cannot be trusted to be on the boards of any of these organizations that are deciding what terms of service.
Yeah, but they are.
Who should have access? It's really who should have access to the internet.
Yeah, I know. That's
this isn't just about money.
It's worse than that, Dave, because when they start to pressure the credit card companies, and I would consider this a warning to everyone who's listening, it's like, okay, let's think this through. So the New York Times last week wrote an article about the credit card's complicity in loaning money to that terrible tiny minority of people who engaged in mass shootings, right? Stating that it was the responsibility of the credit card companies to monitor and potentially prevent that activity. It's like, okay, so what's the idea here? The idea is that the companies to whom we have entrusted our monetary system, in large parts, that would be the credit card companies, now get to review our spending patterns to determine if what we purchase is in accordance with what they regard as morally acceptable. Okay, and we think that's a good idea. That's where we're headed. And MasterCard and Visa and PayPal are already starting to block people. Like MasterCard was instrumental in blocking Spencer.
Robert Spencer, right? It's Robert Spencer, not Richard Spencer.
Yes, it's its best-selling author and the guy who runs Jihad Watch. MasterCard required Patreon to deplatform him.
And just to be very clear, they sent out a tweet, which everyone can find. I'm shocked that they haven't deleted it yet, where they said that they used this word, which I think is the key to the whole thing. They said that they unfortunately had to delete his Patreon because of MasterCard. So what are they actually saying there? Is Patreon saying, oh, we didn't want to delete your page, but MasterCard forced our hand? I mean, that is some deeply scary stuff.
Yeah, well, and we have to talk about hate speech because, I think the whole concept of, look, obviously there is, people can be very nasty when they communicate. But the idea that there's an identifiable category and you can put boundaries around it and term it hate speech, and then you can produce committees or deal with people on a one-to-one basis, as Patreon is doing, without any central policy, or let's say despite their central policy, or that you could turn that into an algorithm that could validly identify hate speech without producing false positives, right? Without accusing people who shouldn't be accused of violating. All of that's just it's just beggars the imagination as far as I'm concerned.
Of course, and you're also just opening a Pandora's box from hell, because just in the last couple of days, I don't know if you saw this, but the Women's March in California canceled their rally because they felt that it was too white.
Yeah.
Now, imagine if they canceled their rally because it was too black or too anything else. It's like, so does that now count as hate? Are you guys now being racist against white people? Now, we know that wouldn't be a problem for these guys.
One of the things that I can't fathom in some sense, is the lack of imagination on the part of the people who are engaging in censorship of what they regard as hate speech. Like, there's an old military adage, which is that if you invent a weapon, it will be used by your enemy within 15 years. Okay, so what makes the people on the left, because they're the ones who are doing this, what, as you can clearly see in the Change the Terms website, what makes them so sure that exactly the same tactics won't be used against them, like at the drop of a hat, once the tactics have been validated and put in place?
I think it's either just very short-sightedness on their hand, or they think that they can actually stamp out enough hate within that very small window before it would turn on them, or they just don't think these things fully through. But yes,
yeah, or there's another possibility too, which is that they're so opposed to the fundamental structures of the West that, let's say, and regard them as so patriarchal and oppressive, that they'd be willing to take the risk of sacrificing their own free speech just to have their destructive way, something like that.
We should also acknowledge that in the New York Times piece that was written, which was written by Nellie Bowles, who wrote the now infamous piece about you and enforced monogamy, that the quote that Jacqueline Hart, who is the head of trust and safety over at Patreon, the quote
right, and there was no grounding in philosophy or any of the background training that might be necessary to even remotely begin to participate properly in such a thing.
No, of course not. But so the quote that she gave Nellie in the article said that you can't say these, I'm loosely quoting this now, you can't say these words on our platform, referring to Carl, referring to him saying the N-word in that video, which we know they were using out of context and all that. But he never said it on their platform. He never said it on Patreon. He didn't even say it on his own channel that was using Patreon for the funding. So there was it's almost the entire story was built on quicksand that tried to put out there on the New York Times. Now, of course, myself and many other people tweet the hell out of it and gets hundreds and thousands probably of retweets and comments to Nellie. And she doesn't respond, nor does the New York Times issue any sort of correction about the most fundamental piece of the story was a lie. And they don't have a problem doing that. So that's why this is so layered about speech and finance and journalism.
Well, it's so amazing to see journalists take like one of the things that happened in Canada to me was that, after I made the initial videos that caused such a political furor, was that once the main journalists in Canada sort of figured out what I was doing, they all came out in my support. Like the Post Media Group, which is 200 newspapers, all came out to support what I was doing because they realized that, well, they're journalists. Apart from comedians, there isn't anybody who relies more on the principle of free speech to justify and allow their occupation even to exist. Mm-hmm. But for the New York Times not to understand that this threat is also a threat to everything upon which their entire organization has been predicated is also an indication of that same kind of willful blindness that we've already been discussing. But having said that, I would still like to say that I think the biggest danger here, it's just made my jaw drop over the last couple of weeks thinking about it, is the fact that the credit card companies are now taking it upon themselves to potentially police the activities of their users. It's like, my God, is that really, I just can't believe that any sensible person would think that through and then want to live in a society where your spending habits are being monitored by the company that basically produces your money. Jesus, I can't think of anything more totalitarian than that.
To loosely quote our friend Eric Weinstein, should Republicans be allowed to use roads? That's sort of where we're headed here. That every public good will be eventually decided. Will you have access to it? Will you have access to water? Should an avowed white supremacist right now that is potentially watching this or lives in America somewhere?
One of the 50 of them that exist.
One of the 42 of them, should they have access to water at their home? Should they allowed to get electricity at their home, or phone lines, or all of these things? I mean, this is where we're headed, especially when you ever expand the definition of who that person is.
Yeah, they won't in China. Right.
Well, that's where they're going, right? So is that the test case?
Well, I think it's an indication that the fact that the Chinese have been tempted into this is also an indication of the temptation that's intrinsic in the technological power. The credit card companies are in a weird situation as far as I'm concerned, because the only reason they work at all is because people actually trust them completely. Right? It's like, oh, you're just a proxy for money. Like, you're a proxy for cash. In fact, that's basically how MasterCard advertises itself, right? So you're a proxy for cash, and the government doesn't watch what you spend your money on except in extraordinarily limited cases. I mean, there are money laundering laws and so forth, but that's in direct violation of a law, right? That's part of tracking down criminal activity. That has nothing to do so far with hate speech, which, by the way, is protected by the First Amendment.
Yeah.
So, or which means, in some sense, that it doesn't exist, as a legal concept.
Right.
It does in places like Canada, which is
right. We shouldn't gloss over that fact too, because Jordan, we just did however many countries in Europe, and we're going to go back this spring, and it's like everybody that we met was jealous of the freedoms that we have in the United States relative to speech. Yeah. You know what I mean? And everybody that would come up to us after the show, holy cow, I wish we could say that. And I wish we didn't worry about this or that or jokes or the rest of it. And we did that video in Oslo where you talked about Dankula. And it's like, they're jealous of our freedom. So we should be very clear here, though you're right, because we now have a payment processor issue, which is in direct connection to whatever it is that we're trying to build out here. And it's a little amorphous at the moment.
Yeah.
Is that it's changing, because a lot of people are saying, all right, you guys really want to solve this, then you have to go full crypto.
Yeah, and the problem.
The video has to be hosted crypto. Yeah, the finances have to be hosted or have to be done via crypto.
Yeah.
All of these things. These are major things that we're trying to figure out on every front. Certain payment processors are a little more willing to stand up to the mob than others. So we're talking to different people. I mean, we're really going on every front here.
That's right. Well, the tentative platform that we're trying to build, and to build carefully, will provide the possibility of multiple payment portals, in the hope that the creators will be less susceptible to being rapidly shut down, or perhaps shut down at all.